January 1944. The early half of 1944 sees the Allies making slow gains against the Japanese Empire's grip in the Far East. Offensive ground operations in Burma by both U.S. and Commonwealth forces begin to make inroads against Japanese defenders. Mongdal falls in January to British and Indian troops. Merrill's Marauders began their campaign behind Japanese lines in northern Burma, whilst General Wingate and his Chindits conduct similar operations as part of the Commonwealth's contribution to the Burma campaign. By July, the Allies triumph at both Yampol and Kohima, a serious setback for the Japanese. In the Pacific, the U.S. captures the Marshall Islands, further eroding the Japanese footprint in the Pacific and tightening the noose around Japan. To the west, Japan re-emerges its ground campaign in China, targeting the air bases used by the U.S. to attack Japanese shipping and the mainland. Meanwhile, the battle for New Guinea continues to rage since Japanese invaded in early 1942. Allied troops, mostly Australian and American, have been fighting the steady battle for the islands. In January 1944, the Australian 9th Division captures Sio, and in April 1944, the Australian 7th Division enters Madang, leading to a period of consolidation before further offensives are launched. In China, the tensions between British, Chinese, US, and Soviet interests make effective military operations difficult. China resents assistance in Burma, but recognizes the need to reopen the Burma Road for logistical reasons. Increasingly, China becomes the victim of US and Soviet strategic maneuvering. Hitler recognizes the pressure that Japan is facing and that without the Pacific Theater, the full might of the US could be brought to bear on Europe. With the need to keep the Commonwealth and US occupied on two campaigns, he authorizes the unparalleled sharing of RIF technology with Japanese Imperial scientists in an effort to balance the power in the Far East. June 1944, as the U.S. Marines begin their invasion of Saipan and the Mariana Islands, the Japanese Navy trials its first submarine utilizing elements of RIF technology. At this stage, the ability of the submarines to stay submerged is largely extended. Recognizing the potential the submarine fleet has to alter the balance and the power in the region, the Emperor orders substantial efforts in the improvement of submarine technology. The three I-400 submarines are redesigned using RIF tech improvements, and a further three are commissioned. The Battle of the Philippine Sea occurs during the U.S. operations around the Mariana Islands. This indecisive engagement between the main naval fleets of the U.S. and the Empire of Japan. This results in both navies losing two of their major carriers, although Japanese aircraft losses are much higher than that of their U.S. counterparts. This is attributed to U.S. improvements in training and equipment, whilst the Japanese carrier aircraft become increasingly outdated. Criticism of Admiral Spruance's cautious command of the battle led to his removal. The Japanese Navy has been sorely bruised, but not knocked out of the war. July 1944, the U.S. Marines land on Guam and Tinian, rapidly taking the islands from the Japanese defenders. On completing the liberation of the Mariana Islands, the U.S. are poised to begin a push towards the Japanese mainland. In China, Operation Ichigo continues with massive Japanese operations against U.S. airfields in the east of the country. With many of the best Chinese units fighting in Burma, Japanese gains are steady, if not initially spectacular. October 1944, the U.S. forces invade the Philippines. Numerical superiority on land, sea, and air leads the U.S. forces to miscalculate the opposition they are facing. The fast carrier task force charged with supporting the initial invasion is caught poorly prepared by a surprise Japanese submarine force, including Suicide Man torpedoes. While damage is relatively light, the task force is thrown into chaos and disarray, with many supplies for the invasion being lost. The resulting invasion is subsequently poorly executed, and although a beachhead is secured and the Japanese push back from Leyte, the defenders exact a heavy toll on the invaders. November 1944. In New Guinea, the Australian 6th Division launches a fresh offensive in the Wewak and neighboring regions. What should have been a relatively routine mopping up of the Japanese forces in the area is destined to become a protracted and difficult fight that drags on for months longer than anticipated. December 1944. The Imperial Navy completes its first I-400 submarine, the largest submarine in the world. I-401 and I-402 follow in January. Escort submarines are completed using similar endurance and stealth technology. Smaller attack subs are commissioned, each capable of extended periods submerged and near impossible to detect using traditional methods. the Imperial Japanese Navy starts planning to reverse its losses to the US Navy. As the land campaign in Burma grinds on, Commonwealth forces occupy and reopen the Burma Road, greatly improving supply lines to the embattered Chinese forces. In China, Japanese forces reach the French Indochina border, cutting off a swath of China from the rest of the country. US air bases are relocated further west. February 1945, the US Navy suffers its first losses to the new Imperial Navy submarine forces. Alarm and confusion amongst Admiral Nimitz' staff caused delay to the plan to invade Iwo Jima and subsequently Japan itself. Naval intelligence staff frantically worked to understand the capabilities of the Japanese new submarines. The Japanese received Rift Tech from Germany, focused on synthetic fuel and jet engine technologies that are rapidly enhancing the Luftwaffe. The Kika jet interceptor is rushed to completion using this new technology. In the Philippines, the U.S. 6th Army continues to advance and capture ground for the Japanese forces occupying the country. Launching attacks around Manila Bay, the invasion fleet is hampered by both kamikaze aircraft and manned torpedoes. Again, the operation is disrupted, and this time significant damage is done to the U.S. 7th Fleet. The planned invasion is aborted to avoid a repeat of the casualties suffered during the landings at Leyte in the previous October. In China, U.S. General Stilwell requests command of all Chinese forces to better coordinate operations. The Chinese are outraged, and Stilwell is removed from command of U.S. forces in China. U.S. frustration with the Chinese leadership is clear, and sympathetic Soviet offers of support to China are considered in detail. April 1945. In New Guinea, the Australian 6th Division secures Malbrick and begins construction of an airfield. As reinforcements and supplies start to arrive in May, the Japanese 18th Army counterattacks. For the first time, they use Rift Tech reanimated corpse soldiers that have been inserted on the island in the preceding weeks. Simultaneously, the Japanese Navy's new stealth submarines drive off the British Pacific Fleet Task Force supporting that operation, seeking the recently repaired HMAS Hobart. The U.S. Navy carefully replans their operations to take Manila Bay. A cautious approach results in the convoy reaching Mindoro intact, and a landing is made against little opposition, much of which had been disrupted by Filipino guerrillas as part of the build-up to that operation. June 1945. The respite for Japanese on New Guinea allows for a period of reorganization as the lifting of Allied naval blockade results in sufficient quantities of supplies getting to the beleaguered defenders for the first time in months. Tensions within Allied high command centers on the need to waste men and resources on essentially what is a trapped Japanese force. This indecision, as in other theaters, would be costly to the Allied troops in months to come. The U.S. Army consolidates in the Philippines and begins its march on the capital, Manila. The spearhead is led by the new armored infantry units, but the suits prove unpopular with the users in the climate and the terrain. They are, however, initially effective in blunting the Japanese resistance. The last elements of the Japanese 28th Army are defeated in Burma, finally freeing the much-needed resources for elsewhere in the theater. Siam remains ostensibly loyal to the Japanese cause, but can do little to aid the fight, although rumors of Japanese submarines operating from Siamese ports would prevail throughout the coming months. July 1945. Using the newest Rift Tech advances available to them, the Japanese Imperial Command launches a concerted counterattack to halt U.S. advance in the Philippines. Effective raids by both air and sea result in the U.S. Navy being forced away and separated from their land forces. Stealth submarines, jet fighters, and conventional torpedo bombers prove too much for the conventional defenses of the U.S. fleet. Unsupported, the U.S. forces on the island dig in, and the Japanese push reinforcements onto the island, including their new Rift Tech battle frames. The increasing threat of Chinese communist forces and the lack of Chinese government's will to risk its forces against either the communists or the Japanese leads to increased U.S. pressure and rhetoric. China becomes increasingly belligerent, content to just hold its ground and let the U.S. lead the struggle against Japan. August 1945. Realizing that the battle for New Guinea is beyond their current resources, the Japanese Imperial Command decides to use the forces stranded there as a way of absorbing both Allied resources and efforts away from other areas of the conflict. Limited resupply and reinforcements are fed into the battle-weary 18th Army, but emphasis is placed on creating a Rift Tech capability specifically centered on the neuro-reactivation of dead soldiers. In doing so, the Japanese begin to surpass even the German scientists that have initiated the research. In Philippines, the Japanese advantage in technology drives the US forces into a defensive posture, relying on limited submarine and airdrops for supplies to maintain their position. In an almost reverse of the previous 2 years of fighting, the US Army digs in and holds on under intense pressure from the Japanese forces. Intermittent resupply and cat-and-mouse game at sea means that no significant reinforcements can land. With the protection of India assured, Britain's immediate need for further gains in the theater are diminished. They are subsequently drawn to this struggle in New Guinea and the need to help Australian and Commonwealth forces. The US vocally states that the British obsession with sideshows is frustrating. October 1945. The US forces in Manila are finally overwhelmed and forced to surrender. Elsewhere in the Philippines, the US forces have enough numbers to hold their positions, but without reliable resupply, they are restricted in their offensive options. Recognizing the advantages RIFTech has given the Japanese army, the US commanders call for comparable equipment, but much of which is prioritized already to Europe or is being diverted to stabilize the Persian front.